I would like to start with a brief disclaimer. Although I will be talking about many aspects in which Barfield's and Plotinus's views about logos are quite similar, Barfield rarely drew on Plotinus's ideas directly. One of the reasons for that might have been the fact that in the first half of the 20th century, Plotinus was viewed as more of a mystic than a philosopher, as well as a representative of a period which was thought to be a period of decline in ancient philosophy, definitely not on par with the genius of Plato and Aristotle, whose works Barfield studied far more thoroughly. This might have stopped him from noticing the striking similarities between his own ideas and those of Plotinus. One of the avenues through which his concepts might have nevertheless slipped into Barfield's thoughts is the work of Rudolf Steiner, who talks extensively about Plotinus, for example, in his lectures on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. But that's a topic for another time. As it stands, even in his as of yet unpublished notes, which are currently being researched, Barfield very rarely refers to the Enneads. He was, however, greatly inspired by the broader Neoplatonic tradition through such figures as St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, as well as early and middle Platonism, from Plato and Aristotle to Philo Judaeus, the tradition influenced Plotinus himself. Some of those figures I'll return to later in my talk. Another short disclaimer that all the English quotes of Plotinus, which you will see in a moment, come from a translation by Arthur Hilary Armstrong, so probably the translation which everyone is the most familiar with. Okay, now, firstly, we must consider what exactly is logos for Plotinus. The Greek word is famously hard to consistently define, even within a work of a single author or sometimes a single passage. This great difficulty of grasping the precise significance of the term is matched only by its importance in Greek thought. This makes the attempts at translating it incredibly challenging, with even the efforts of the most skilled classicists being restricted by the limitations of their native language. And thus, in the translations of the Enneads, including the translation I'll be referring to more often, we find a wide range of proposed meanings for logos, from a simple word or expression to the rational principle responsible for the creation of our sensible world. It's not uncommon to encounter it as logos in a description of a particular concept, like one of the hypostases, with it later serving as a name for a seemingly completely separate idea. Those drastic changes in meaning might very well be attributed to the general practice of ancient thinkers to use familiar words for denoting philosophical principles instead of inventing new terms. But we shouldn't be too quick in dismissing those instances as mere inconsistencies or imprecision of terminology. An important thing to consider is that our perception of some of those distinctions might be the result of our modern outlook, and that these distinctions might not have existed or weren't as pronounced for Plotinus and as well as his contemporaries. Barfield himself cautions us against accusing ancient authors of confusing seemingly separate meanings in this way, viewing it as one of the signs of logomorphism, which he defined as projecting post-logical thoughts back into a pre-logical age, and presented as one of the greatest obstacles to our understanding of pre-modern thinkers. Therefore, it may be far more valuable to try and grasp the connections between those seemingly different meanings rather than attempt to precisely determine their differences. This way, hopefully, we might glean what exactly was the relationship between the nature of words and metaphysics for both Plotinus and Barfield. A brief reminder of Plotinus' vision of the world might be useful, as logos occupies an important, though at places ambiguous role in the structure of reality expounded in the Enneads. According to Plotinus, the universe comes into being through a process of cyclic emanation, with each level of existence being a product of the activity of the preceding one, as well as its less perfect image. This process begins from the one, tochen, or the good, tagathon, a perfectly singular and whole absolute, which is beyond being and defies definition. The one generates a second hypostasis, intellect, nous, which occupies the domain of the intelligible forms and is at the same time a multiplicity and a unity, for each form contains in potentiality all others. Returning back towards its higher origin and contemplating it, each level of reality creates the next one, with intellect giving rise to the world soul, psyche, which in turn creates our everyday sensible world. In some passages, it is these two lower hypostases which are described as logos, logic, or expressions of their respective predecessor. To quote, soul is an expression and a kind of activity of intellect, just as intellect is of the one, end quote. It appears, however, that the term can also refer to a separate hypostasis, something which originates from both intellect and soul, but is at the same time distinct from them. Quote, this rational principle, logos, then, is not pure intellect or absolute intellect. It is not even of the kind of pure soul, but depends on soul, and is sort of outshining of both, intellect and soul. That is, soul disposed according to intellect, generated this rational principle, logos, as a life which quietly contains a rationality. And in another passage, but the rational principle is the product and expression of intellect, coming after intellect and no longer belonging to it, but being in something else. Quote, this peculiar placement of logos in the structure of reality may seem confusing, as it seems to not line up precisely with a clear picture of descending emanation, as it traces its origin to two of the hypostases instead of emerging from a single one. This does, however, highlight the crucial aspect of Plotinus' vision of the world, that being the seamless unity that's the whole structure. Distinctions made between different levels of reality and conceptual division into the hypostases doesn't imply strict boundaries between them, with logos being a prime example of that. This logos, usually translated by Arthur Hilary Armstrong as a rational formative principle, serves as an intermediary between the intelligible reality of intellect and our material one, which is the final product of the soul. By contemplation, theoria, of the intellect, the world soul apprehends the representations of the intelligible forms and projects them onto the sensible world, shaping it in accordance to the formative principle, which serves as the ideal model of all things. Through it, physical bodies not only receive their respective qualities, but are at the same time differentiated from and connected to one another. And thus, the whole structure of the world is organized as a unity in multiplicity, mimicking the eidetic model. Because of that, logos is described as the all-encompassing source of our reality. To quote, "Arche logos kai anta logos." To further illustrate this system, in one of his treatises, Plotinus compares the world to a melody, which is composed from conflicting sounds, but nevertheless form a harmonious unity, because they are governed by rational proportions. This unity exists not only in spite, but thanks to those opposing forces, which give structure to the whole, all in accordance with the rational logos. Quote, Now, the rational forming principle of this universe, which comes from a single intellect and a single life, both of them complete, is not a single life nor any kind of single intellect, and is not at every point complete, nor does it at every point give itself whole and entire to the things to which it does give itself. But by setting the parts against each other and making them deficient, it generates and maintains war and battle. And so it is one, even as a whole, even if it is not one single thing. End quote. This unifying role of logos is closely tied to its nature, which, like in the case of intellect and soul, is at the same time singular and manifold. Quote, for it is a rational form, which is one and many, and all being is one. Quote. Apart from the singular logos, a hypostasis emerging from intellect and soul, Plotinus talks of numerous logoi, which serve as the former principles of sensible bodies, imparting on them their specific identity and characteristics, their essence, ousia. For matter, phila, doesn't possess any characteristics or identity by itself. And in some instances, it is even characterized by Plotinus as non-being, and thus it is merely a passive substrate. Thus, any body is actually a synthesis of matter and attributes determined by the formative logoi. You might say that as forms could be said to be described as thoughts of the intellect, so logoi can be characterized as the thoughts of the soul. By actualizing different logoi in matter, the soul creates the physical cosmos together with all the living beings existing in it. As you can see, it is sometimes hard to pinpoint the exact distinction between the world soul and in its capacity as the world's creator and logos, if such a distinction even existed for Plotinus. The soul itself is characterized by him as a logos that comprises the sum of all logoi, which represent its creative powers. Quote, soul, is a forming principle itself, and the sum of the forming principles. And the principles are its activity when it is active according to its substance. This leads us to an aspect of the doctrine of logos, which is important for both Barfield and Plotinus, that being the creative power that belongs not just to the world soul, but also to individual human souls. It is closely connected to the Platonic conception of human memory based on the notion of anamnesis, according to which all knowledge is simply our soul's remembering of the prior, not in temporal but in causal sense, a level of reality. Our soul contains a reflection of the eternal logos, which directs it to our divine origin. It is by remembering this higher reality that the soul creates this universe, borrowing the templates for all things from the other higher world. Quote, but if it forgot them, the intelligible realities, how is it the craftsman of the world? Or what is the source of its making, if not what it saw in the intelligible world? End quote. This way, the traditional ancient vision of man as a microcosm, which was carried on into the Middle Ages, is being brought a step further. Rather than making him the epitome of creation, it places man himself in the role of the creator. According to Plotinus, each individual soul contains within it all the logoi in existence, which further ties to the overarching unity expressed many times in the Enneads. To quote, and we do say that each soul possesses all the forming principles in the universe. Quote, This idea of us creating the reality we live in is absolutely crucial to Barfield's outlook, expressed most extensively in his book Saving the Appearances. There, he combines the Greek doctrine of Logos with the Jewish mystery of the divine name, the Tetragrammaton. In this regard, he, of course, follows the example of Philo Judaeus, who was the first to join these two traditions together in the realm of philosophy, doing so in a way which, interestingly enough, shows a lot of common ground with Plotinus' idea of Logos and its primary role as an intermediary between the sensible and the intelligible. But let's return again to Barfield. In his book, Saving the Appearances, he points to the etymological connection between Yahweh and the verb to be, as well as its closeness to the Hebrew name for Jew. And quote, the texture of the language hints that a devout Jew would hardly name his race without tending to utter the Tetragrammaton. When any true child of Israel perused the unspoken name, Yahweh may have seemed to come whispering up, as it were, from the depths of his own being. Here Barfield sees the same truth that was expressed in the Greek doctrine of Logos, that being the inwardness of the divine word within humanity. Divine word, which is at the same time the source of the phenomenal world and incarnation of wisdom in man. For Christians, the developing apprehension of this truth found, of course, its culmination in the figure of Christ, Logos incarnate. One of the biggest changes that Christianity brought to the ancient doctrine of Logos was its different concept of time. I already talked about logoi of Plotinus, which give properties to matter, creating complex bodies, including those of living beings. In the Enneads, this serves as an explanation for the transmigration of souls, which was a basic element of Platonic doctrine. Since each soul contains within it all logoi, by actualizing a different set of them each time, the same soul could not only reincarnate as a different person, but even as an animal or a plant. This was tied to another key element of ancient metaphysics, that being the cyclic conception of time. Since the number of logoi existing in the world soul and their possible combinations is finite, or probably very, very large, after all those options are finally exhausted, a new cosmic cycle was to begin. This cyclic conception of time was, of course, challenged by the Abrahamic religions, which introduced the idea of not only the temporal beginning of the world, but also its upcoming end. When speaking of these things, Owen Barfield greatly emphasizes the changes that the ancient doctrine of Logos underwent when reinterpreted by Christianity. For example, in his Barfield's worldview, we don't really find a place for the world soul with all its functions assumed by the Logos. Another one of those changes was the subsequent connection of Logos, identified with the figure of Christ, with a particular point in time. Because of that, the religion for a Christian cannot be, as Barfield states, only dictated by a personal relation between man and the absolute, but also with history of humanity itself. To quote, for the Christian, accordingly, religion can never be simply the direct relation between his individual soul and the eternal Trinity. As long as we ourselves are occupying a standpoint in time, so long, interposed between the first and third persons, all history in a manner lies. End quote. For Barfield, an important aspect of this history is the evolution of human consciousness and the role of artistic creation in it. In his book, Barfield presents how, as human consciousness developed, gradually losing its instinctive felt participation in the world surrounding us, our awareness of man's capacity for creative activity increased. It was focused in particular on poetic creation, which of course brings us back to Logos. Barfield points to the Romanticism and its great emphasis on creative imagination, which appeared in reaction to the scientific revolution, as one of the biggest steps in this process. He does, however, see early examples of this growing awareness in antiquity, which brings us to one of the very few instances where he refers to Plotinus directly, quoting his Enneads. If anyone disparages the arts on the ground that they imitate nature, must remind him that natural objects are themselves only imitations, and that the arts do not simply imitate what they see, but reascend to those principles from which nature herself is derived. End quote. Artistic creation isn't the only way in which man imitates his creator. The human being's rational abilities of memory and speech are the culmination for both Plotinus and Barfield and also St. Augustine. The rational abilities of memory and speech are the culmination of the process of receiving, or rather participating in, the psychic power stemming from the realm of intellect. As the sensible world is an image or representation of the intelligible, so human works are representations of the intellect and bring forth its content to be at the disposal of human mind and imagination. Quote first on Barfield: the human word proceeds from the memory, as the divine word proceeds from the Father. Proceeds from it, it remains one with it. For the world is the thought of God realized through his word. Thus, the divine word is also forma exemplaris. The phenomena are its representations, as the human word is the representation of intellectus in acto. End quote. And another one from Plotinus this time. The intellectual act is without parts and has not, so to speak, come out into the open, but remains unobserved within. But the verbal expression unfolds its content and brings it out of the intellectual act into the image-making power, and so shows the intellectual act as if in a mirror. And this is how there's apprehension and persistence and memory of it. End quote. It is important to point out that what is meant in this context as word isn't mere speech, but something more akin to verbum as understood by St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. Not just a name for something, but rational activity, which is just as, or even more real than the thing that is being named. For those authors, as well as their ancient predecessors, like Plotinus, thinking or knowledge of something was an actual union with it, and the completion of the naming process through which the thing achieved full reality. As we can see, for both Barfield and Plotinus, human capacity for rational thought and verbal expression place him in a unique position as a bridge being, an intermediary between intelligible and sensible world, thus fulfilling the same role as the Logos, the unifying rational principle, does, governing the process of emanation, which is the foundation of all creation. While everything else can only be present in the intelligible through its archetype, man possesses a unique ability to reach there personally, thanks to the inwardness of divine Logos within.
Thank you. But thank you for that splendid account of this fascinating rapport between Plotinus and Barfield. Forgive me for one of my own interests and obsessions. I think a key figure here is Plotinus. A key figure is Coleridge. What Coleridge thought was a very important book for Barfield. In fact, I think it's one of the best books ever written about Coleridge. And Coleridge is a figure we know from his biography was reading Plotinus at a very early age, who cites Plotinus in absolutely key figures in the Biographia Literaria in his Aids to Reflection. So I think even if it's difficult to find direct references to Plotinus, it's definitely there in a tradition that Barfield knew intimately. Matthias and
yes. Thank you. I want to refer also to Victoria's paper because I think both of these papers they show us the reception of Plotinus at the turn of the 20th century. So a historical point, but very, very interesting. So exactly who was Plotinus in the first decades of the 20th century? You mentioned that briefly, because when Victoria was talking about, and I wasn't sure if that was her interpretation, your Victoria interpretation of Plotinus or Bergson's, but it was completely not accurate in the sense that we were hearing about Plotinus rejecting the sensible world, this continuity between, from what we now know about Plotinus, is that there is a profound continuity and the hierarchical descent of being and the great appreciation of the sensible, all of them. But in fact, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Plotinus was seen as a philosopher who hated the body, who all was about the escape from the sensible. So it was like Armstrong said, because the last sentence of the Enneads is so easy to remember, and the last sentence is about the escape from this world. Everyone thinks that the whole of Plotinus is about that. But so I think also Bergson was discussing a different Plotinus than the real Plotinus. And the same may be the case with Barfield, which is interesting because Coleridge was reading and appreciating Plotinus, Steiner was reading and appreciating Plotinus, but Barfield, he didn't, for some reason, delved into Plotinus directly, and maybe, like you say, Plotinus was seen as this late figure, more of a mystic. We know that Breyer, for instance, he compared Plotinus to Indian philosophy, Advaita Vedanta. So it was all in the air. Jacques Maritain, who was a student of Bergson, when he mentions Plotinus, he mentions him in the context of Hindu mysticism. So I think that, but interestingly, the whole doctrine of the inner word that you show here, we now know, but they didn't know that at the beginning of the 20th century, that there is a direct transmission from Plotinus through Augustine to Aquinas. This is the same doctrine. So whenever Barfield is speaking about the inner word, most often he refers to Aquinas, and indeed because of Steiner, probably because Steiner believed that Aquinas, just like Wayne Henke, Steiner believed that Aquinas synthesized Aristotelianism and Platonism. That's why Steiner prefers Aquinas to Plotinus. But this is the same doctrine, right? So in a way, it's an interesting situation that Barfield is all the time talking about the Plotinian motives, but he always refers to Augustine, to Aquinas, to Areopagite, and very rarely to Plotinus himself.
In fact, may I just add that, reinforce that, mentioning an anecdote about life in Cambridge in the 20th century. So John Rist, Dennis O'Brien, and Henry Blumenthal were all contemporaries in Cambridge at a time when studying Neoplatonism was the end of your career. So still, I mean, and they all three of them, are some of the most important scholars of Neoplatonism in the 20th century. They all left Cambridge, largely, I think, because Guthrie and the other figures thought Neoplatonism was just mystical nonsense and really not worthy of serious study. So this reticence about Plotinus, I think it can be put down to some of these factors, which persisted well into the middle of the 20th century. And one of the things that we've experienced within our own lifetimes is this extraordinary explosion of commentaries and interest in Plotinus in particular, but also the other Neoplatonists, and also as key for understanding not just Christianity, but the other great Abrahamic traditions. Yes, so I think actually Matthew was first. Sorry.
I'll try to be brief, even if there's so much we could say. This Coleridge book might have more significance than what I thought, because as you were talking, Mateusz, of course, whispering, "Oh, the German idealists would like that one," and I'm looking at this, I'm thinking I've seen these before, and there are things here that are in Biopolitics, Platonismus, and Idealismus as kind of arguments for saying that Schelling is this new Plotinus. And then you get to the Tetragrammaton, and I remembered the passage from the Philosophie der Offenbarung, which I found where Schelling, who is a Hebraicist, analyzes what it means in order to get to his idea of, Gott als lebendiger Geist, the whole etymology of it. And one wonders how Barfield could be so close to Schelling in some of these things, but the answer, I think, you get Coleridge.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to look something up while you're talking there. Ben, thanks for a fascinating paper, and I think you gave a really interesting account of Barfield's kind of indirect, as we've discovered here, this sort of indirect absorption in a sense of Plotinian thought. And one of the things that's emerged in some of our collaborations on this research project that we're working on at the moment is looking at Barfield's early Platonism. It's interesting the first three books he lists in notes in 1925 on his reading list for that year is The Republic, St. John's Gospel, and Iamblichus. So already we have this synthesis of Christian Neoplatonist thought. I was going to ask you what your thoughts or interpretation were on. There's two things I think are really fascinating about Barfield's relationship both to Plotinus and then how he develops his own philosophy of the creative logos through Coleridge in a sense. But one was this quote where Barfield says that he says Plotinus, Plutarch, Iamblichus, he goes on, Henry Moore, Blake, Goethe, Emerson were no doubt very much unlike each other in many respects, but they were all in a way aware, in a way that Pythagoras and Plato were not yet aware, the active role of individual human spirit. So in Barfield's evolution of consciousness argument, his understanding of this centre of a shift of the centre of inwardness, as he calls it, which in a sense eschatologically is realised in the incarnation and person of Christ, is that Plotinus somehow signifies some kind of break with the classical past in some move more towards his imaginative as opposed to inspirational direction of history, from a kind of original participation to a newer form. And I just wondered, in your studies, is there anything that you had come across or understood from your investigations that might point to why Barfield maybe held that view, even though he doesn't comment in particular on Plotinus in many places?
I think that what I recall, Barfield sees the same trend reappearing and re-emerging in different ages throughout the history of our civilization in all kinds of mysticism. So probably it might be connected to the fact that, as we talked already, Plotinus was viewed more as a mystic. So Barfield also take some time to, for example, when talking about Plato, he points to the common ground between the Plato and the more Eastern mysticism, and something these characteristics of it that weren't inherited by Aristotle, for example, with more rational in the sense of being focused on this sensible realm. And I think that he viewed Plotinus as another example of maybe not direct transference or continuation of one tradition, but this emergence of some inward awareness of this mystical truth of the inwardness of the.
Was it from the rediscovery of meaning? This
I think it's from that essay, yeah. I'll possibly quote it.
Do I remember correctly that Steiner in his lecture on Aquinas, he says that Plotinus didn't develop individuality enough, right?
So Augustine who developed.
Yeah. So Steiner's argument is that individuality emerges fully with Augustine and then Aquinas, but Plotinus, for Steiner, he seems to see individuality as not fully individualized. So that would mean that Barfield didn't follow Steiner.
Yeah.
When he says here that Plotinus is the first in the line of these who think about the individual in a new way, that would be an interesting way to.
Absolutely, yeah. There's also this wonderful quote from Barfield, and again, I think there's this emphasis on his transformation, and he wrote a lot on the Logos as understood through the inner word. And he says, in the course of Earth's history, something like a divine word has been gradually clothing itself with the humanity it first created, so that what was first spoken by God may eventually be respoken by man. So that, it's Origen in the sense, the descent of the Logos into man, so that man might ascend to the Logos. But the point you made as well about the I am, Barfield writes really beautifully on this, where he says, if we understand the figure of Christ as a sort of transformation, history, and consciousness, then Christ's words in saying things like, I am the light of the world, are this synthesis of a kind of originally participated consciousness with a historically participated consciousness. So I think there's so much of interest there in his unusual take in some senses on aspects of Christian theology around